Thank you for joining us here at Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we invite you to send in your questions and we'll explore the fascinating stories of Mississauga together. Joining us this week is special guest Pardeep Singh Nagra, the Executive Director of the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada, which is located right here in Malton. He's also a respected public and motivational speaker, human rights activist, and athlete who dedicated himself to charity, diversity, and tolerance, and also a wider focus, I guess, on Canadian identity and what it means to be a good citizen. Pardeep, it feels like yesterday, honestly, but probably about a year and a half ago, you did a presentation with the Museums of Mississauga on Brothers in Arms, and focusing on Sikh Canadian soldiers in the First World War, and I was blown away by the presentation. And I've had it in the back of my head to reach out to you a few times to kind of explore these topics a little bit on this program. So thank you, Pardeep, for joining us and spending some time with us here at Ask a Historian.
No, my pleasure. And grew up here in Malton since elementary school. In fact, did all my schooling, and been able to combine the history of my hometown with one aspect of history of Sikhs in Canada and the military history and a number of connections. And so there's just so many fascinating tales that I can't wait to explore with you. So thank you for the opportunity.
This is wonderful. So before we start off, there might be a portion of our audience, and I've had a chance to visit your museum a handful of times over the years, and hopefully things are opening up again. We can make that a little more frequently. But can you tell us a little bit about the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada?
Yeah, well, we say a small space with a big punch, right? Because sometimes if you physically come into our space, you would almost say, so this is the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada. In fact, it's our gallery. And I say it's our gallery because we also don't use the traditional model of museums where we are the center of the artifacts and the information and the stories. In fact, this is just a platform for us to launch. So similar to what we're doing today and having these conversations, it's a launching pad, the museum. We've partnered with exhibitions around the world, in the US and in the UK. We've now, in our short history, have done 2 what we call national exhibition and lecture series. So we've exhibited right across Canada and had talks across Canada. Equally, one of them featured, went around literally with just a folding table and 10 artifacts in a suitcase. And said, 10 objects spanning over 150 years of Sikh history in Canada, and just literally putting them on the table as part of the presentation and saying, well, yeah, ask which one are you interested in, and I'll tell you the story. And even when people ask what's at the museum, we say we're actually sharing Canadian history through a Sikh lens. That's what you're going to experience if you come to the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada. You're going to experience Canadian history through a Sikh lens. Right. And we say that because too often, even in my own educational experience, the history that was taught did not necessarily, I would say, was both not accurate or inclusive. Right? I went through an educational system, literally right here locally in Mississauga, right from kindergarten, right through high school, onto university, and predominantly did most of my studies at the University of Toronto at Mississauga. And never once was I shown a picture of a Canadian early settler or pioneer who looked like me. Never once was I shown a picture of anybody with a turban, and again, somebody who looks like me, serving in World War I or II. And we're one of the largest per capita serving groups in World War I and II. And I can still walk around in 2021 and 2022, and people will be shocked, saying, "You guys served?" And that's because of this erasure of history. The timeline alone in our museum, if we're to do what we call a guided tour, it'll take close to 3 hours. Just the timeline alone, with all the different original artifacts we have attached to it. Individuals have come and spent 6-7 hours hanging out at the museum here in our space, and we haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's available, what's around. It's just giving people some touch points, something to be inspired about, something to have a great sense of pride and history, and something to move forward with.
Right. So you're very right. I'm sorry, I don't mean that to editorialize it at any stretch, but I had a very similar upbringing. I'm similar age to you. I went to UTM as did you. I didn't know that connection, by the way. And you know, for someone like me who grew up also studying history and focusing on that, until your talk, what I knew about Sikhs military history connecting to Canada was non-existent, frankly. And I'm not somebody, I don't think, who has sought to erase history in my own sense, but it's what I'm taught, right? It's what I've learned, and so I think that was the biggest eye opener to me, was not only that these stories survive, but the sheer is enormity the right word? The sheer presence of Sikh soldiers, right? So if we can maybe segue into that realm, can you talk to us in kind of an overview sense of what, and we'll share links afterwards for more information as well, but Sikh soldiers, here we are, you know, I'm really lousy at math, but April is the anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and I know there's certainly a Sikh presence at Vimy Ridge. I can see the V for victory behind you there. But just from the First World War, and then if we can also do some of the Second World War connections as well, just can you give us an overview of that military involvement, Sikhs in Canada, and just that connection to these significant moments in history?
Yeah, and it's a fascinating tale when we're looking at the contributions, because on the one hand, you would almost question, why should there be any Sikh contribution in Canada in World War I and II? And you might ask, but Pardeep, why would you start with that? Well, the reality is twofold. Number one, the Sikh community was disenfranchised in 1907 in Canada. And it took the community 40 years of advocacy for the right to have franchise, to vote. So on the one hand, ask any Canadian, anybody living in Canada, to saying, would you serve a country that is not giving you equal rights as a citizen in that country? Okay, so that's the first piece of the question of the why on a larger geopolitical framework. Number two, there's no denying, and I'll speak about this piece as well, that there was rampant racism and discrimination going on during the time periods of World War I, World War II, and even today. I'm not going to deny that somehow it stopped and has ended. But it was at a level where you know, I mean, look at the civil rights movement in the U.S. You know, there was literally segregation happening. And then number three, one of the really important moments of Canadian history that a lot of people don't know is that the very first time Canada as a country turned away a migrant ship, a would-be Canadians, a would-be migrant ship from its shores, was the Komagata-Maru in 1914. And it got turned away literally July 23rd. After sitting 2 months in the port of Bernard Inlet. 2 months of the journey, 2 months sitting, and then a 2-month journey back. So 6 months for these passengers. And what's fascinating about that, and why I have to set this context, is that every single person on that ship was actually a British subject. Their documents identified them as British subjects. They had more right as migrants to come ashore to Canada than anybody of what we define as European stock. Right. These were British subjects that were being turned away from their own British colony, for which you and I today still know, because we have a Governor General and Lieutenant Governors, and our head of state is still the Queen. And how could, for lack of a better word, the Queen or King's subjects themselves not have the same opportunity to go around the Commonwealth? So the Komagata-Maru gets turned away, carrying predominantly Sikh passengers. There are Hindu passengers and Muslim passengers as well. There are 376 passengers. Around 240 of them were Sikhs. We're told we're not wanted. July 23rd. Literally 7 days, a week later, World War I starts. And within a month, the advance of Germany was beyond powerful. they were literally starting to take over the Western Front. And so the same people that are not wanted, because if you look at, when we look at even just military history anywhere across the board in the diaspora, you're usually looking at family traditions. Yeah, I served, my father served, my great-grandfather served, or, I served, my mother served. It's this military tradition that we have. Traditionally, we talk about military families, right? And so then the call comes for help on the Western Front. And what is the largest available contingent of people and army available to the British? The British Indian Army. And so who's being called to serve and protect are the same individuals, the brothers, predominantly that time, because it was male dominated.
Right.
Villagers, because village was pretty much considered family. So from the same families that these passengers, when we're looking at the village list of where recruitment was happening and soldiers were being represented from, were from the same villages of these passengers. So on the one hand, you're not wanted, and on the other hand, you're actually needed.
Right.
And what happens is we answer the call. And the irony of this whole tale is literally almost to the day that the Komagata Maru arrives back in the port in Budge in Calcutta, and we get shot at by the British authorities, the same British who are wanting us to serve. There's another ship arriving on the shores of France, literally to the day in third week of September, carrying people who look like me to serve on the Western Front. And if you actually read any what I call accurate and inclusive accounts of the Great War, and remember now, so this is happening, people who look like me have arrived onto the battlefield. Canada doesn't even technically know where it stands fully yet as a nation, and when it's going to actually fully say we have entered the war fully as a country, versus a few regiments started to go a little bit towards the end of 1914, but literally 1915 is when Canada officially decides to enter the war. And here we are on the Western Front, and it's miraculous in terms of the valor for which we were there. And you look at a number of military historians who actually had said, we turned the tide of the war. In fact, Germany and everybody thought that it was going to be over by December.
Yeah.
The way that the war was going, the wave of it, the momentum of it was this thing was going to be over quick.
What was that? The idea was home before the leaves fall, or something like that.
Right. Yeah. And then so what happens is the momentum gets stopped. And not only does the momentum get stopped, now there's a counter push.
Yeah.
And then the war starts taking a whole different dimension. And yes, it lasts out a number of years, but this is what precipitates that pace. So what starts happening here? What's going on? Sikhs in Canada are disenfranchised. The fellow Sikhs are just turned away a week before the war starts. But yet we already know from the history of early Sikh settlers and pioneers that a number of them had already served and were serving what we define as the Crown.
Right.
Whether it's directly as part of the British Indian Army or in some of the colonized places of that time of Hong Kong and Singapore and all those places, that we were actually serving not only as part of the military, but as part of the frontline police forces. Right? There's many images of Sikhs in Shanghai and in China and Hong Kong stuff serving in uniform. And in fact, there were stories that some of these early settlers, when we were getting disenfranchised and stuff like that, were literally burning their medals in protest and opposition of how can we be treated this way for the same people we are, for lack of a better word, serving.
Right.
Yes, I know the Great War was a great war for civilization. We weren't technically there serving a person or the crown itself, but as representatives. The Sikh community also took a very, very interesting approach that people might not be aware of from an anthropological perspective. Every single Sikh soldier, regardless of what we call their village or their ancestral family name, all entered the war through one surname, which for Sikhs is supposed to be only our surname, and that is Singh. Every single soldier to the last, when they signed their attestation papers, signed as a sovereign people, as Sikhs, as Singh.
If you can you elaborate, because I that was one part I had a question. I know I've spoken to you about this before, but just for our audience, what does that you said the anthropological statement, but Singh represents something in the culture?
So when the Sikhs pretty much became what we call an order of the Khalsa, right? The larger term to define the Sikh people, the Khalsa. There was a time where all males were to take on the surname Singh, and all females to take on the surname Kaur.
Okay.
And it was about not just gender equity, but gender sovereignty, and what we call geopolitically individual sovereignty. And I say that because there are people who will still even question me having this conversation with you, saying, Pardeep, why are you really speaking on the valor of these people who were slaves of the British? Right? And I said, which people were slaves? Because if you're talking about the Sikhs, we never have been and we never will be in our history slaves to anybody, or even any ideology, for lack of a better word, that contradicts the concepts that we hold true and important, the concept of equality, of humanity, of justice. Right? And so each of these soldiers to the last went in under this identity of saying we are sovereign in this war as a people entering this war.
Right.
And that was important because that was that they were pretty much also defining we're not going in as anybody's puppet or a slave. And that's significant because how they conducted themselves was not to make happy, for lack of a better word, the king or the crown. It was our duty as for humanity and as humans, and our civilian duty, and we made sure that that's why we're there, right, for the greater good. And so when you're looking at these concepts, because we're going to get into the heart of part of this conversation, was then, but there's a tale of Sikhs who ended up fighting for Canada. How did that come to be, right?
Especially
right?
when you've been disenfranchised just a few years before. I mean, that's
disenfranchised a few years before. Yeah. Fellow members of the community are being returned back. That's well known. The news travels right through the community, predominantly heavily in Vancouver, where the majority is. But then the ones who were just leaving Vancouver around that time and coming into Ontario, because there's a number, as we're going to talk, that signed up in Smith Falls, Ontario.
Well.
Right? and so, but then that other piece where we know, and it was not just the Sikh experience, it was the Black experience, it was the Indigenous community experience, that yes, Canada was looking for people to serve and wanted and needed people to serve, but they were only actually looking for white people, right? And so it's not necessarily that the fellow Indigenous Canadians or Black Canadians or Sikh Canadians were open arms saying, by all means, the more the merrier, let's go, right? Thank you. The so-called brothers in arms, you're here to be together to so-called fight an enemy, right? And so then you had to navigate that aspect as well. And you know, but it's interesting because, you know, when I talk about that concept of duty, that's also a concept of honor in the community, right, within the faith, right? And when you want to hold up that duty and honor, right, that pride, right, that's what will define somebody at the end of the day, right? When the call comes to serve, are you willing to serve? right? And it's interesting because I have in front of me from a Toronto Telegram from 1915, a fascinating article, because we're talking about this connection also from a historical military family connection piece itself. And the lead title on the article says, urged his son to enlist. And it says, father declared he would go if boy did not enlist. And the stories about the 2 Sikhs and the Canadian regiments, Private Wilkinson Singh and Private Harry Singh. And it was Harry Singh's father who sent this message saying, if you will not go, I will go, and shame on you. And that was the message received by Harry Singh, right? Who listed in the 9th Mississauga Horse Battalion, right?
Right.
And if I recall in the letter, I think the father's 60 or 70 years old, right? Right. But you know, that was still the zest and the zeal. And I could probably tell you the numbers would have been much higher. The numbers would have been much higher. But I know the difficulties that even the ones that were going to enlist would have had as part of it. And we know, in fact, let's be honest, some of them were literally snuck in.
Right.
Because names were changed. Their faith affiliation was written as something else, just to make it look like just to get in. They're just one of us, you know, they're part of the Catholic Church, right? And anything to so-called pass that little test, right? The eye test, the mustard, however somebody wants to define that piece, just to see if individuals can get in. And so, but yet those tales are fascinating as well for the ones that did, because as small of a group that we actually have history on, and we know the circumstances for which, and we know it could have been a large group. We've ended up coming across so many different documents and artifacts that speak to even their story of the handful that went, and that history, believe it or not, Matthew, is sitting right here in Ontario. It's sitting in France. It's sitting in Belgium. We have 3 soldier graves of the group of 6 soldiers that fought on behalf of Canada in Kitchener-Waterloo, in France, and in Belgium. Yep. And it's fascinating when you just even look at the headstones that can be a documentary in of itself. And hopefully we'll have imagery and pictures for individuals to see as I'm speaking about these narratives, that none of them were correct if we look at it from what should have been on the headstone and how it should have been done. And even for Bookums, we actually have the request card that was sent to the family to ask what they want on the headstone. And what's fascinating is that you look at just even the headstones alone, and you see the very first Sikh to enlist actually enlisted in Quebec, right? Sant Gujjar Singh, right? And his headstone has a Sikh script written on it. So there was actually at that time, from a military perspective and from the headstone perspective, they're quite inclusive, because they actually had a specific Sikh script, which was put on the headstones of a Sikh soldier who passed away. But the funny part is his doesn't feature the maple leaf, right? Representing which country he is serving from.
What does it have? Does it have anything?
Doesn't have anything.
Really?
On the other hand, Bookham Singh's has the maple leaf, but doesn't have the Sikh script on it. Right?
Yeah.
And then Lakshman Singh's has a cross on it, but doesn't have the Sikh script on it, right? And Bookham Singh's doesn't have any cross on it, right? So just from that, and listen, I know what was happening during the war. I don't think that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's #1 priority was to have everything exact details. And so as historians going back, we know what the reality of the war was. Listen, we know that there were some that just literally had markers on the field, and we're going to maybe get back to them. We know some we just never got a chance to recover. We know there are still things we're recovering every year right now in some of the battlefields. We know there are some families that don't even have what I'm speaking of, right? In terms of these markers. And this is nothing against the Commonwealth. I'm just sharing from a historian perspective some neat anecdotes about even those pieces of history that we have.
It tells the story, though, right?
Like, it tells the story. Right?
I mean, you have what I find remarkable is, and I know you speak on this, but you have a country that basically said we don't want you, but now we need you, and you have people that went, I'm going to serve for my honor. I'm going to stand up when called upon and serve this country that has chosen not to include me in other things. And so maybe that's your brothers in arms. I mean, Black soldiers and Indigenous soldiers also face very similar. It's almost like you look at there's a book on Japanese Canadian internment called the Enemy That Never Was.
And I was going to speak to that.
This concept is striking, and it's something I think we need to come to terms with in Canadian identity. If we celebrate the positives and the good, we also have to embrace the less than stellar moments in our history.
Absolutely. But even within the less than stellar, the silver linings, the things we should take pride in, right? That we know the harsh realities for which some of these soldiers had still entered in and wanted to serve, and then how some were still being treated, right? Second, third class citizens or non-citizens even, right? Because they weren't even being able to get the citizenship, right? So, but it's fascinating when we look at these pieces because we have we found letters, we found documents, we found newspaper articles, in fact, even found medals, and those are interesting stories as well. There's an individual that actually has Wilkinson Singh's one of his medals, right? Because there were a couple of medals that soldiers would have been awarded in their service in World War I. Yet there was another tale that had come across, unfortunately, after the fact, because we know this also as historians around a number of different things. And if we're looking at from a military perspective, sometimes in different times during history and circumstances and famine and poverty and a whole bunch of other pieces, sometimes the worth of the medal was just the medal itself. If it was silver or what have you. Then other times medals get lost or who knows where they end up, and sometimes people buy medal collectors as a lot, right? And they got a lot of medals and names on them and stuff. And who is interested in a medal with somebody's name on it, right? Like if it's just another one of a number of soldiers, or someone doesn't have for lack of a better word, individual family or vested interest in it. Like we have vested interest in Sikh medals, right? So we don't need to differentiate much beyond that aspect than knowing that it's a Sikh soldier. But on the other hand, sometimes there are individuals saying, well, I got these two medals of a family member. I don't have this third. I'll like to not have a replica, but an original one. But the only original one that are available have people's names already under them. So maybe, and those technically can sometimes just go for 20, 30, 50 bucks, right? Depending on it, but it's an original medal. But yet, if someone can just erase the name and everything off the medal piece itself, then you've still got an authentic World War I medal now with nothing on it per se in terms of not knowing who the name was, and you can put it as part of your medal collection. So what ended up happening was, I believe it was Lachman Singh's medal that somebody on a military form wrote that they were just disheartened because they just were walking into a jeweler, and the jeweler had all these medals hanging around, and he just by coincidence asked, "What's going on? Why do you got all these medals?" He said, "Oh, somebody came in, and they just want me to erase the names and stuff." And we know that once you erase a name, the regiment, everything, it's erased history forever. And so the individual, just I guess because they just felt it, said, "Do you mind if I at least write the names of the individuals who these medals are about to raise, because he doesn't have control unless he wants to buy them all off
Right.
the person.
Yeah.
And then what are you going to do with them just because you're disheartened about a name being erased, unless you're willing to put your money, for lack of a better word, towards it. But he said, at least I'll do something in terms of keeping these names a little bit alive, and took all the names and posted them on a forum saying, hey, just, it's Hearten, this and that, but these are the names of the individual medals that are going to be erased. And one of them was Lechman's, and I think by the time anybody even could find out and the names were posted, was not enough time to go and so-called stop the erasing of it, right? And that's a Canadian Sikh soldier, right? So there are those stories as well that come about, right? And there's parts of the stories who we still haven't known and may never know, right? But it's fascinating nevertheless, because really the purpose of this presentation, the purpose of the talks that we engage in, is to really provide Canadians with what I call a more accurate and inclusive history, right? And so to ask a historian, for someone like me, is to be able to provide a more accurate and inclusive history, for example, even about the war, of who served for Canada, who served with Canada, because you were talking about Vimy Ridge's anniversary, and there was literally the Lahore division, literally a Sikh regiment attached to Canada on Vimy Ridge, fighting side by side, right? We're talking about Flanders, right? And got a lot of imagery of Sikhs in Flanders and Flanders Village, and the battles of Ypres, the first and second and stuff. And we were already there in Flanders before Canada arrived. And speaking of the great poem of Flanders, right? Right. And so this is why it's important to have, because next time Remembrance Day comes around, or next time we are just talking about service, next time, even if somebody on pop culture or in the media wants to talk about service in the poppy, right? We have a different social capital that we can now engage this conversation with.
Absolutely.
Right. And that's why it's important to have these conversations.
I couldn't say that any better. This is one of the things. But I remember your presentation again from the museum's perspective, and thinking back, like I've read so much about First World War over the years, particularly, of course, Vimy Ridge, as many Canadians have. Governmental publications around Vimy Ridge, and not a mention, right? Like you have soldiers who are serving and dying alongside, and as Canadians, and still, not kind of included in that broader narrative.
Yeah, and not only as Canadians, because as you're talking about, Matthew, as broader narrative, how many times do we go and say, oh yeah, we're over here celebrating because we know that this country or their soldiers served with us at this battle and this battle, so we want to honor that, honor that friendship, the companionship, right? I haven't seen that with the Sikh community, right? And yet I can spend days and weeks with you around letters that have been written that we've come across, right? Stories that have been shared and talked about. And we're still getting that because we're just on the cusp. And I know we're also going to be talking about possibly World War II. I'll tell you, for some of the works of my colleagues, for example, Stephen Purwall from Indus Media Foundation and his award-winning book, Canadian author of Duty, Honor, Is It, has talked about that there almost is not a week doesn't go by that somebody comments on one of his social media posts or just on his pages, talking about how if they had somebody who served, they had a grandparent or great grandparent that served, how they spoke of the Sikhs. Because the one thing that's unquestionable is anybody that served with a Sikh during World War I or II has a whole different perspective of who and what we are, unmatched almost in military history, in terms of how we carried ourselves and how, like, look at Warrior Singh's letter, which was written in the original Sikh script of Gurmukhi, but he says, the bravery which we showed that day was the admiration of the British soldiers. After the fight, they asked me how it was that I was so utterly regardless of danger. Okay, these are the words of a Canadian soldier who happens to be Sikh. Right. When is that day that after our education, because we relatively have gone through school, and my children or my grandchildren or my nieces or nephews or any other kid, non-Sikh alike, is going to get a chance in their classroom for a letter, a soldier letter from World War I of a Private Singh letter, a Canadian letter that has never been in our classrooms. Just ask yourself, Matthew, right now, if I were to walk into a classroom today and ask students right through from K to 12 to draw pictures of soldier graves, would you think any one of them would put the Sikh script on there?
Probably not.
If I asked any one of the students to draw a picture of a soldier that served in World War I or II, do you think any of them would draw a picture with somebody with a turban?
Right.
That's the place that we owe fellow Canadians. Not only a reality check, but again, I'm going to keep repeating these words, a more accurate and inclusive history narrative. And that's where we need to be ultimately, because exactly what you had said, our textbooks don't reflect that yet. No. Anybody writing a book on the war, look at, just if you want to know how intense this is, I will even step back a little bit. Pre-World War I, there's a phenomenal so-called Hollywood movie that came out called The Darkest Hour. Do you know who it's about?
Nope.
Winston Churchill, right?
Yeah,
just came out a couple of years ago, right?
Yep. No, yes.
Yeah, because I just triggered your memory, right?
Yep, you did. Right? I was going down a different path, but yes,
a different path, right? Trying to think about that darkest hour and where it would have been. But so this is why I said before World War I to talk about, and why I'm bringing it back before World War I is because if this was considered one of the greatest military minds of the last generation, and speaking about this darkest hour where he had to make these big world decisions, wouldn't you think that it's just and appropriate to actually, in the movie, start with where he started his military career off? Where he served for the first time on the front lines?
Yeah.
Because then we'll find out he not only served with Sikhs, he was actually in the Sikh regiment.
Right.
On the Northwest frontier in 1897. Right? When we're talking about these kind, it's not just to be able to share a Sikh story, it's to share a Canadian story.
Thank you for spending some time with us here at Ask a Historian. And thank you to Pardeep Singh Nagra for connecting with us and exploring connections between Sikh Canadians and the First and Second World War and broader topics around Canadian history and Canadian identity. This is part one of part two. So join us next week for part two of our interview with Pardeep. And as always, keep sending in your questions and we'll explore the stories of the city of Mississauga together. Like, subscribe, and follow us and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga.